We just drove 500 miles. We just drove 500 miles. We just drove 500 miles.
So does it matter? And can you even tell the difference? Let's go. Now in general, when I use reverbs on the mix, I actually use multiple reverbs. I tend to use reverbs for blend, for size, and for coloring a signal, so that together they paint a nice delicate reverb picture, which could be different for every track, but which still has some coherence by using those same reverbs on different tracks, just more or less of them. And if you want to know more about my reverb strategy in a mix, I have a separate video on that, which I'll link at the end of this one. However, if I do need to pull up just a single reverb on a vocal, for example while recording a vocal with a singer and providing him with some initial comfort reverb during playback, I typically select the plate reverb. So in this video I'm going to compare a couple of different plate reverbs to see how they differ. Do they differ? Can you even hear a difference? And I will also provide the tracks that I'm going to let you listen to as a download in the description below, so you can have an even more detailed listening session in your own DAW of choice. Now most of the plate reverbs that I'm comparing are typically below 100 euros or dollars. So they are not the most expensive ones, but they typically just differ from the more expensive variants of these same manufacturers by having a lot more flexibility in the settings and not by the sound of the reverb engine. So before we now go into having a look at these reverbs, if you like these types of videos, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and ring the little bell icon so you know when I post another video. But let's now have a look at the reverbs that I'm comparing and how I set them up. So the project that you're seeing here contains 7 vocal tracks. Well, it contains 7 copies of the same vocal track actually. And it's a vocal track from our band The Wash from a song called 500 Miles. And I'll put a link to that song in the description as well, so you can have a listen to the full track. And this particular vocal track was recorded by our bass player Peter from Perfect Sounds Unleashed. So thanks Peter. And I already did some processing on this track. I basically made it a bit more smooth by applying some typical processing that I do in the mix, and I have a separate video on that as well, which I'll also link down in the description. But let's have a quick listen to how this sounds without reverb. So I'll turn off the send to the reverb and let you listen.
We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy.
So very dry. And the first reverb that I'm trying out on this is the Lexicon Vintage plate. This is basically my golden standard for Lexicon type reverbs. It's quite old already and I've been using this as my main vocal reverb for many years already. And I typically select category vocal plates, and as preset I select the vocal plate 2 preset. And I usually don't touch any of these settings except for the pre-delay, because I usually set it to a value which is synced to the tempo of the song. As you can see, the tempo of the song is 124. So that means there are 124 beats per minute. So basically we have 60 beats in a minute. And if I then divide it by 124, I get the timing of 1 beat, which is about half a second. But that's a bit much for pre-delay. So I basically continue dividing it by 2 until I get in a range which I sort of like for pre-delay. Well, this gets in a bit of a range. So this is like 60 milliseconds. But actually when I tried this, I liked it better if I divided it by 2 once more, which is 30 milliseconds. So if you look at the pre-delay of this reverb, I set it to 30 milliseconds, and I've basically set it to that for every reverb that I'm demoing in this comparison, as well as the reverb time. I also tried to match up the reverb time, and I also tried to match the amount of reverb more or less for all the different reverb plugins. But I didn't really try to match all the different settings that the plugin has, because there can be very many. But for this reverb, I went with these settings. Now, if you have a quick look at all the other reverbs before I let you hear them, so that you can compare them more easily. This is the LX480 Essentials reverb from Relab Development. And as you can see, reverb time about 1.5 seconds, pre-delay, well, 29 milliseconds in this case. And this is the simple version of the more extended version of the LX480. But this one is considerably cheaper. You just have less parameters to adjust, but the actual sound engine is the same. Next up is also the budget version of the Seventh Heaven reverb, because the full version is called Seventh Heaven Pro by Liquid Sonics. And this is a cheaper version, same sound engine, but less parameters to adjust. But as you can see, pre-delay 30 milliseconds and reverb time 1.5 seconds. And in this case, I chose the Sunset Plate C preset. This is my latest reverb acquisition. It is the DVR250 by TC Electronics. This is not actually a real plate. This is an emulation of the DVR250 reverb, which is one of the first electronic reverb boxes. But to me, it has the same characteristic as a plate reverb, so I decided to include it in this comparison. And I'm using the nice vocal preset with a reverb time of 1.5 seconds. And yeah, the pre-delay, they didn't have 30 as an option, so I chose 40. Then I also included the FabFilter Pro R. I started with the preset Vocal Gold Plate, set the reverb time to 1.5 seconds and the pre-delay to 30 milliseconds. Then the EMT 140 from the UAD card. I selected plate C and also set the reverb time to 1.5 seconds. And pre-delay, well, I couldn't adjust it exactly, but I think this is around 30 milliseconds as well. And finally, I also added a stock Cubase reverb, being the Revelation reverb. I started with the plate reverb preset, but then I adjusted the reverb time to sound similar to the other reverbs. I don't have it in the exact time here, but they only display it in percentages. And I also adjusted the mix between early reflections and tail to make it more comparable to the other reverbs. So let's have a listen to how they sound and whether you can actually hear a difference.
We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy.
Okay, so what do you think? Which one did you like best? Or could you even hear a difference? And remember, if you want to listen more closely, I also have the tracks available for download with a link in the description below. It's probably easier to hear any difference if the audio doesn't go through the YouTube audio compression. For me, I do hear a difference, but the differences have gotten more subtle over the years, because basically any of these reverbs now is quite good. But for this particular purpose, I would probably prefer the DVR250 by TC Electronics or the LX480 by Relab Development. But even the Lexicon vintage plate from the Lexicon native PCM collection still sounds very good to me after all these years. I hear a little bit more high-end, but that's something that can also be easily tweaked in the plugin or by adding an equalizer after the plugin. But I'm curious, what do you prefer? And if you want to learn more about how to use reverb in a mix, I have a separate video on that, which details how I use different reverbs to provide blend, size and color in a mix. So have a look at this one, enjoy and see you soon.